Thank you, Jeff. This is an unusual opportunity for many of you. You probably have not heard a presentation on the topic we're covering today. So I'm grateful to Jeff to open this time to address a subject that does pertain to all of us because we are ministering to people. All of us look for good sermon illustrations, and I'm not that I'm going to give you one right now, so you can put your pens away. But I've used a lot of illustrations from the realm of golf, even though I'm not a golfer. Even this past Sunday, I referred to the Masters down in Augusta. And I found that those illustrations work. I've also used illustrations from fitness, physical fitness, and I don't go to the gym that much, but those illustrations work as well. It surprises me as I step back and think of it, though, that illustrations from those two domains can be effective because very few people are involved in those activities according to the statistics. The PGA defines a golfer, are you a golfer? Well, their definition of a golfer is somebody who has golfed at least one 18-hole round in the last 12 months. If you've done that, according to the PGA, you're a golfer. And when it comes to physical fitness, only 15% of, well, let me go back to the golfer. With that definition of, one 18-hole round in the last 12 months, only 10%, not even 10% of the U.S. population are golfers, according to that definition. As far as fitness is concerned, less than 15% of the population is involved in some type of fitness center where they belong as a member. So there's a low level of involvement, but even with that, I have found sermon illustrations from those two domains are effective. Nobody gets offended. They're not awkward. They talk about them out in the lobby sometimes. However, there's another topic that we don't talk about, and its prevalence is far greater. And that is this issue of childhood sexual abuse. Over the decades, studies have consistently shown that at least 1 in 4 women were sexually abused as a child. Some studies show as high a rate as 1 in 3. And disclosure of that abuse is a very difficult thing. The average age for disclosure is when a woman is 26 years old. It's not uncommon at all that a woman would be in her 40s or 50s when she makes her first disclosure of childhood sexual abuse. But the average age is 26, so just think about that. I don't know what age you guys got married, but I was married before that age. And so when my wife gave her first disclosure and she was in her 30s, it was a sudden surprise to me, even though there were things that we knew were struggles in our marriage where we had no idea that we would never have attached it to childhood sexual abuse. But it's the topic that we don't talk about, we're not comfortable with, and when you think of that statistics of first disclosure at age 26, it's affecting the marriage without even couples knowing about it, and it definitely has. The effects of childhood sexual abuse definitely do have a trajectory into marriage. Focused on the family this past year in 2015, to my knowledge, there were at least 4 presentations. They did 4 presentations on how childhood sexual abuse affects marriage. I listened to those, and most of it was on how it affects the woman, very little of how it affects the marriage. I hope to present a little bit more today of how it affects the marriage. But what struck me in all 4 of those broadcasts was that in each session, the moderators said some type of an apology for discussing the topic. We know that this is a sensitive topic, and some of you will wonder why we are talking about this today. I want to say, crying out loud. But that's how we approach it. We just don't really prefer to talk about it. The symptomology of a person who has been sexually abused as a child is just vast. Let me just share with you a quick list. Anxiety disorder, panic attacks, depression, eating disorders, sleep disorders, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts, interpersonal problems, suicidal ideation, sexual dysfunction, and that can go to both extremes. It can go from promiscuity to aversion, anywhere in there in the extremes. Re-victimization, self-hatred, blame, substance abuse, somatic disturbances, self-blame, dissociative identity disorder, PTSD, self-injurious behavior, fear, guilt. Not to say that people have all of those, but those who have been sexually abused have a grouping of those symptoms. We were 10 years into our marriage. Pamela and I were at a pastor's wives retreat in what was then the Midwest District. And we had been experiencing some troubling situations, especially for Pamela, just darkness. And so one night at the retreat, I just stood. It was a group thing of just sharing requests, and I said, you know, I don't know how to tell you to pray, but I would appreciate your prayers for Pamela. She's just going through a tough time. We were there as a couple, and I shared that with her permission. Afterwards, there was a gentleman from the district who came up to us. We don't remember the question he asked, but Pamela's answer was, when I was between the age of 8 and 10, I was abused by the teacher at my Christian school over several occasions, multiple occasions. First I'd heard of it. She was surprised it came out of her mouth. He counseled that night. He really didn't have much knowledge of childhood sexual abuse. He prayed with us, and I thought, okay, you know, should be all taken care of now. And I was really ignorant, had no idea of what the effects are, and I was also arrogant. You see, years later, in the following years, Pamela knew she needed some further help. And I thought that prayer back at the retreat should have been enough. And I was too arrogant also to find help. Now, people in our congregation know that I go to a counselor. I just lay it out there. They know, and they realize I need it. They're fine with it. But back in the years when she first disclosed, it was the kind of thing that as a pastor you really hesitated to say. It was just counseling had this stigma to it, and that was really unfortunate at the time. But my arrogance wouldn't allow me to admit that we really needed help. So many years went by, and 8 years later, Pamela was admitted to a hospital, to the psychiatric ward, for complete emotional, physical breakdown. She was there for 4 weeks straight. That was the first of a couple other hospitalizations. And she was scared, I was scared, I was alone. I mean, this was back in 1991, so some of you guys weren't even around yet, but back at that time, at least I didn't have the openness that I do now. And this is interesting. Not many people were talking about childhood sexual abuse. In the 1970s, there were a lot of books that came out on childhood sexual abuse because, for the first time, the clinical world was discovering that the symptoms of an abuse survivor were similar to the symptoms of the Vietnam War veterans when they came back from Vietnam. And they were connecting all of that and recognizing that it was the post-traumatic stress disorder for both. So a bunch of books got published in the 70s, and then it died out again. It's also interesting, I don't know the explanation for this, but if you look at the copyright of books that deal with this subject, a lot of times now, it was like 1991. So something caused a resurge again in studying this issue, and it was just at that time when it was starting to surge again that this happened, and we weren't sure, our counselor wasn't sure if our congregation would be able to understand. I mean, I told them, you know, Pamela's in the hospital, complete emotional, physical breakdown. She needs rest, but we didn't tell them the whole story until a year later, and we laid it all out. When I mentioned last night, we've been in Mequon for 38 years. That's a miracle. A lot of churches would have had me out on my ear. You know, Pastor, why don't you step aside from ministry for a little while, get your act together, get your family's act together, and then, you know, then maybe you'll be more effective. You know, I was operating like at 20%, but our congregation loved us and prayed us through it. So 18 years go by, Pamela was in counseling, and sometimes on a weekly basis, and I just want, she was supposed to be here today, but she's sick and couldn't make it, but I tell you, she's a vibrant, she's the party girl, you know. Those who know her missed her last night, because she would have had a few of us laughing, and God has done an incredible work of healing. Are there wounds that still get rubbed on? Yeah. But God has done marvelous healing. And then also in the last decade, in order to be good stewards of the healing that God has brought, I went back to school and got a doctorate in social research on this specific topic, because we sense God calling us for some type of ministry, and whatever he does with that, that's his business, and we'll find out. But this June we celebrate 43 years of marriage, and we're just thankful for the healing. While I was in school studying this subject, Pamela said, "I've never felt more loved by you." You know, I don't know if it's because I was carrying textbooks again. I don't know. But I began to piece something together. I was realizing that my empathy was increasing. Part of empathy is being able to know what it is like to be the other person. And I think she was experiencing an empathy for me that she hadn't experienced before. I have two goals today. One is that our empathy for those in our congregation who are caught up in this snag, that we would have an increased empathy. My second goal, if there's some time, or along the way here, to do some equipping as well, that we might help couples. What is childhood sexual abuse? Here's a definition from Dan Allender. I think it's about the best one I found. It's any contact or interaction, visual, verbal, or psychological, between a child, adolescent, and an adult when the child, adolescent is being used for the sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or any other person. Sexual abuse may be committed by a person under the age of 18 when that person is either significantly older than the victim or when the perpetrator is in a position of power or control over the victim. As I've been working on this, I'm discovering, well, usually legally they say, you know, a 5-year difference. If the perpetrator is 5 years older than the victim, that's considered abuse. However, there's another scenario. And that would be, for example, 2 15-year-olds, or 6, make it whatever age you want, 2 15-year-olds, guys assaulting a 15-year-old girl, you know, 2-on-1, and overpowering against her will. The symptoms that come out of that carry the same symptoms as if it was a 40-year-old man with a 7-year-old girl. Childhood sexual abuse slices into the deepest part of the soul. Dr. Clark Barshinger, who's written, I think, one of the best books on this, calls it murder of the psyche. I think that's the best description you can come up with. You saw the list of symptomology. How do you put all of that together? And a gal by the name of Ellen Dykes, when she was addressing the Gospel Coalition, was able to categorize all of it into 5 categories, and I'm drawing from that, but kind of relabeling it. And I want to share it with you as here's 5 categories of the effects of childhood sexual abuse. And the first one is shame. It's kind of, that's the umbrella over everything. A cloud of shame crushes the spirit of the survivor. It's different than guilt. Guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is, I am bad. Guilt is, I've done something wrong. Shame says, there's something wrong with me. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am a mistake. Guilt says, what I did wasn't good. And shame says, I am no good. Within the past few months, and this is after all of this counseling, years of counseling, within the past few months, I'm standing in a room in our house. It's in the morning. I didn't even realize Pamela was up yet. And she came around the corner and into the doorway of the room, and I was just startled. I didn't, know she was there, so it was just a natural startle. By the way, startle effect is a typical symptom of those who've been abused. Now, I startled. I wasn't abused, but the startling can be a little bit more extreme for those who've been abused. So, I startled just a little bit. But she went like that, and then she said, right away, she said, "Do I look bad?" Now, for those of you who know Pamela, she never looks bad. I mean, she is my babe. And it would never come to my mind to ask, do I look bad if I was startled? It would never enter my mind. Neither would it yours, except unless there's some shame there. And deep down, you wrestle with this thing that somewhere there must be badness. Shame does not necessarily come from something I've done. Shame comes from something that was done to me. And it serves like a Novocaine. When we go to the dentist, sometimes they give you the choice. Would you like me to, give you some Novocaine before I drill? And, sometimes you want to do the macho thing, but a few seconds later you're saying, Novocaine, volunteer, do it, give me the shot. Shame is an emotional Novocaine because it blocks the pain. It makes you numb. And there are people in your congregation, now don't diagnose them right away with childhood sexual abuse, but there are some people who are just emotionally numb. Numbness is a lot easier to live with than the piercing pain. So this shame serves its purpose, but imagine what it would be like if you go to the dentist and the Novocaine never wears off. I go to the dentist over in Germantown. When I'm driving back to Mequon, I'm looking in the rear view mirror. I'm waiting for this lip to liven up again because I don't want to walk into the church office with that thing hanging down to my shoulders. So I'm, flapping, tapping away at my lip to get some life in there again. You want that Novocaine to wear off, and if it didn't, I would do myself harm. When it came to lunchtime, I'd be chewing my lip rather than my sandwich, and I wouldn't even know it. There's a consequence to residual Novocaine, and there are consequences to residual shame when shame is unresolved. Dr. Dan Green is a counselor in the Milwaukee area, also a professor at the Elmbrook Study Center. And he's given a great list of some of the consequences of unresolved shame. Afraid of being exposed, feeling disconnected from others, fear of intimacy, avoid making commitments, getting stuck in dependent or codependent relationships, reacting defensively even when minor feedback is given. Let me pause there, because some of you guys are saying, whoa, my wife gets pretty defensive. And some of you women are saying, I think my husband maybe was abused because he really gets defensive. Now, that's not the intent here to diagnose each other. All of us can be defensive. However, here's why there is more extreme defensiveness. It's a protection mechanism. When a child is abused, they think they did something wrong. They feel they are wrong, but they also think, something wasn't right about this. I did something wrong. And so as they get into some counseling, one of the things that the counselor will be working with them on is helping them understand they didn't do the wrong. And it takes a long time for a woman to begin to accept, okay, I didn't do the wrong in that situation. Sometimes it can take years. So they get all of that worked out. But then in another scenario, perhaps with their husband or whoever, when it's suggested that they are wrong on something that is totally unrelated to the childhood sexual abuse, remember, when men are waffles and women are spaghetti, the wiring for a female is all interconnected as opposed to us guys. So especially for a female, this is tough. You don't think I'm right? And all of that is getting intertwined with all of these years of feeling that they did something wrong and that's why they were abused. It's no wonder there are these reactions and struggles from that. There's further consequences of unresolved shame, the social anxiety, and that can range from discomfort in a crowd to absolute withdrawal from a crowd, feeling distant from God and unable to experience His love, all sorts of mechanisms in order to block the pain, whether it be workaholism, shopping, substance abuse, gambling, sexual addictions. There's also a feeling powerless, feeling that because they were powerless in the abuse, but they grow up to feel that they really can't do anything. Experiencing depression, anxiety, addictions, and they may be even driven towards suicidal thoughts, and in some cases, suicide. Now, before I go on, I wanted to mention earlier, my studies are in regard to wives who've been abused and how it affects the marriage. I realize here in this room that some of you guys were abused as young boys or young men. And I don't mean to overlook that at all. That's not my area of study. I do realize that a lot of what I share rubs on some wounds. And for women who are here, what I share here is your story. I realize that in a crowd like this. I've had to leave that in the hands of the Holy Spirit. And my congregation back in Mequon is praying for this session, because I know that wounds get rubbed on. Some wounds will be open, maybe for the first time. But I just want you to know that our Lord is the healer of wounds. He is. Now, in these marriages where the wife has been abused, why wouldn't a husband want to be helpful here? And I'm not saying that husbands aren't helpful, but there's three big barriers. One, he wants to help, but she can't receive it. Remember, she doesn't think she's worthy of this. That's what shame does. It's difficult for women who've been abused to even accept a compliment. So she doesn't want the help. Another barrier is that he wants to help, and he sees her as his project. And that leads in all sorts of codependency. This was more my story for many years. Illustration here. I do go to a counselor. And a couple years ago, I was there on a Monday, and my counselor knew that the weekend was kind of a difficult situation. So he asked me this question: Bill, what was it like to preach yesterday? And my answer, just right away, I told him how I thought the congregation responded to the preaching. So he let me just, oral diarrhea. He just let me, go with on my answer. And I got done. He said, and what was it like for Bill yesterday when you were preaching? And I realized I missed the question. And with his rephrasing of it, I also realized I didn't have a clue as to how I felt. I was so enmeshed in the relationship with Pamela, and even after she had healed, there was enmeshment there. It's one thing to have empathy, but enmeshment is the other's, is not empathy at all. Empathy, I gave you half the definition before. Empathy is knowing what it is like to be you without losing the awareness of what it's like to be me. Knowing what it's like to be you while simultaneously knowing what it is like to be me. And I just kind of lost myself for years. And so that affected in a very dysfunctional way our relationship. And that's what happens in these marriages, especially when a husband sees his wife as a project. Thirdly, sometimes husbands find the barrier of helping their wives because they're just in shame themselves. There have been many occasions I've shared with smaller groups this type of information, or that I was in the studies for this, and I'll have a guy come up to me afterwards and he will say, "Me too." That's all he says, "Me too." He can't get it out. My wife was abused. It's me too. The shame. And pastors and ministry workers, these folks are in the woodwork in our pews and in our chairs. They don't know how to come forward and talk about the complexities of what they are facing. The marriage books aren't addressing this, and yet it's having effects on marriage that brings many of them to divorce. So shame is that first effect. That was where I wanted to spend most of my time. Second effect is the loss of voice. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One would be that the perpetrator imposed a threat. If Uncle Charlie is the one who did the abuse, he probably said something like, no, we're not going to tell anybody about our special time together. Silence. Or another reason for the silence is that the child has not had the development in order to have the vocabulary to express what was going on. How can a child find the vocabulary to describe what happened in Uncle Charlie's cabin? And so this shame numbs them verbally, emotionally. This is how it affected our relationship. In the early years of our marriage, I was a controller. I was domineering. Okay, since this is on video, I'll have to be honest. Okay, in the early decades of our marriage, I was controlling, domineering. So Pamela comes into this marriage. Remember, she's been silenced. So when I had all of my dysfunctional ways of controlling, it just wasn't in her to be able to speak up against it, to be able to call me out on some of my poor behavior. And I just thought she was the sweet, good wife, the good pastor's wife. Here's what I want us to understand for sure, and that is there are complementary relationships in these situations. Yeah, because of the effects of abuse, there was baggage that Pamela was carrying, but I was somehow drawn into that because of the complementary baggage that I had. And though it was necessary for each of us to get our individual though it's helpful for us to have counseling together, each of us needed individual counseling as well to work through that individual baggage that was in our lives. A third effect is the distorted beliefs. Distorted beliefs about just about anything: sexuality, fatherhood, manhood, God. Those of you who wear eyeglasses like I do, if there's a smudge on your lens, it kind of drives you nuts. We all know what that's like. But you can get by with it for a while. Your eyes adapt and they look around the smudge. That's not abuse. Abuse distorts the lens. Everything you look through is distorted. And so there's a distorted lens through which to interpret life. All of life seems unsafe. Just not sure what's going to happen. The environment is being scanned. The social setting is being scanned by those who have been abused because there's not a sense of safety. That's why sometimes for those who've been abused, they're pretty overprotective of their children because they know what could happen. It's also distorted in the sense of not being able to trust. God intends that children develop a sense of safety and security from their parents. And when that is granted, it carries over into adulthood and their ability to develop healthy relationships of trust in adulthood. However, when that parent or caregiver violates that trust, the ability to trust is sabotaged into adulthood. So you can have a husband who is consistently faithful to his wife, consistently demonstrates efforts to support and to reaffirm and reassure, but even with all of that, she will still struggle, and it will prove sometimes futile because there's this fear within her that her partner will prove untrustworthy at some point. That's just the sad thing of this distortion. So there's a distortion for interpreting life, there's a distortion for how we see God. I mean, what do you make of God? Who is he? He's got to be mean. He's got to be punishing. Because how do you take a loving, sovereign God and put that together with childhood sexual abuse? How could that ever coexist? Is God trustworthy himself? I love what Ellen Dykus has said. Healing comes when childhood sexual abuse can be interpreted through the character of the Redeemer, rather than interpreting the character of the Redeemer through the lens of childhood sexual abuse. Now you can take all sorts of human difficulties and place it in there. That's a strong statement. For many women, this doesn't happen overnight. It develops spiritually in their lives. Fourth thing is a twisted body image. It's the fourth effect. Women who've been abused view their body as being dirty, evil. Dan and Nikki, one of the guys that I interviewed, Dan and Nikki, in their previous relationships before they met, there was some promiscuity that went on, but when they met, they both committed together that in their relationship, that they would live purely until, they would live purely and keep themselves for marriage. So they did, and they were looking forward to their wedding. They had great expectations of what their sexual intimacy would be. They get married, they went to the hotel room. Up in the hotel room, Dan began to unzip the back of Nikki's dress, and she just fell apart, started crying, just became unglued. As Dan described, he said, when the tears happened, it was like, all right, game on, what's happened here? Sexual dysfunction is common in marriages affected by childhood sexual abuse. So let me ask you, is the guy going to come and talk to you about that? I mean, he's being emasculated. He's not able to have sexual relationship with his own wife. She's just not able to do it. So not only is he dealing with rage of the perpetrator, but his manhood is being sabotaged. Who's he going to talk to? What book is he going to read? Women not only view their body as dirty, but some see it as to be idolized. Another guy interviewed, by the way, these are all pseudonyms, another guy interviewed, Chad. He described his wife's sexual preoccupations. Now, for the guys whose wives, where it's all aversion to sex, the guy whose wife is preoccupied with it, I think, well, that'd be a good deal. That would work. I could live with that, right? No, not so. It was so bizarre. He said it was just so vile. There were times he just wanted to get out of the house. It goes to its extremes. She was idolizing her body in all of the different ways that she was in her dysfunction. Another thing about the body, it's to be blamed for what happened. If the nausea hasn't set in yet, it might here. It's possible. It doesn't necessarily happen all the time, but it's very possible that when a child is sexually abused, let's remember, God made our bodies, and as disgusting as it could be, there can be for the child a pleasant feeling. Is that child grows into womanhood and realizes that when she was abused, even though she may vomit over it, she realizes that there was a pleasant sensation at times. She doesn't know what to do with it. How do I put that together? And so the body becomes the enemy. And that leads to the self-injurious behavior. I will mutilate my body. I hate it so much. Look at how it reacted when I was being abused. That is not to say that any woman who's cutting was sexually abused. However, there is a strong correlation between the two. Some see that their body should be sold. Engage in what's common to them. Use it as a commodity. And women in prostitution and pornography use their body as an instrument of power to gain back what they had lost. By the way, if you're struggling with pornography, just try to remember this. That woman that wants to entice you so much is one that was probably abused earlier on, and you don't want to go there, do you? Here's the challenge. You can't get away from your body. And your body is brought into the marriage. Who are these couples going to talk to when they're dealing with these things? Is it any wonder that there is this deep rage within for the woman and for the husband? A fifth effect. I want to spend a little time on this, and then I'm going to stop if there's Q&A, and we can make it an ending point. But I want to be sure to cover this. I call it fragmented mind. Or for those familiar with these things, the term dissociation. Many of you would remember the account of the story of Tina Zahn. Dan, you probably remember her attempt to end her life by jumping off the highest bridge in Green Bay. She was driving a car, just got out, ran over to the edge, and was starting to go over, and a state patrol officer miraculously caught her, saved her life. She wrote a book. It's unfortunate that it was given the title it was given, but I think the publisher wanted to make sure it would sell. So the title of the book was Why I Jumped, and then the subtitle was about postpartum depression. Now, not to minimize postpartum depression, but I read the book and it was hardly about that. It was all about her childhood sexual abuse. How she would be abused by her stepfather, and her mom knew all that was going on. She had just multiple symptoms, difficult relationships. But one of the things that's pointed out in the book was the fracturing that went on in her mind during the abuse. She would mentally, when she was being abused by her stepfather under the desk in his office, she would mentally go across the street across the street of their house to the fire station. As a young child, she viewed that as a safe place. So that's where she went mentally. And I believe that though God allows evil, such as childhood sexual abuse, to occur, I believe he ministers to the victim through this mechanism of dissociation. One of the guys I interviewed, for his wife, in her mind, she went up to the corner of the room. That's pretty common for those who dissociate. It's always up in the corner of the room. But in her case, Jesus was up in the corner of the room. And he held her in his arms. And the tears were, as she was dissociating, here's what she saw. The tears were flowing down Jesus' face and onto her body and washing her clean. I love how Wes stated it. Wes was one of the guys I interviewed. He said, "Isn't that just like God? Isn't that just like the God we have, to provide a mechanism for little kids to escape the awfulness of what they're going through? God is not violating man's free will to do good or evil. So there was this guy doing evil, but God isn't going to intervene and say, this guy can't do evil. No, that guy can still do evil, but he, our loving God, provides a mechanism for little kids to escape the awful reality of where they are and still be able to stay sane." When this coping mechanism, though, is carried into adulthood, it develops into a dissociative identity disorder. Wes woke up in the middle of the night. That was not uncommon because his wife was always having nightmares, which is common for survivors. But in this case, she was particularly disturbed, and he could tell that she had been dreaming of one of the aspects of the abuse. And so he kept a journal nearby. He grabbed it with a pen, and he gave it to her. And he said, you write this down so you can talk it through with your counselor the next time you see him. He looked over a couple minutes later as she continued to write, and she was holding the pen as a child, writing in the journal, printing as a child in the vocabulary of a child. There were times when Wes would come home and he would say, I didn't know if I was coming home to my wife or to a child. Now that's a bit of an extreme form. Every one of us in this room dissociates. You go to the dentist, you put your head over at some beach, that's where our minds go as you're getting drilled. All of us do dissociate to an extent. But obviously it carries into extreme forms as it did for Wes's wife. There are times when women who dissociate as a coping mechanism will actually then speak in more of a child's voice. Pastors, please hear me. if you ever deal with couples and something like that happens, don't start casting out demons. I'm not saying the demonic cannot be involved. I am not saying that. But don't start casting out demons. Imagine what that does for a woman who, with all her heart, is trying to serve the Lord and follow Him. And now, oh, I'm so bad that I'm a temple of the demons as well. I've known this to happen. And it sets a survivor back light years. There's a B.G. Braun has developed the Basque model I'm going to introduce to you. Behavior, affect, sensation, knowledge. Heather Gingrich, this is an Ivy University book, Restoring the Shattered Self. If you want to delve into this more, tremendous book. I'm still working my way through it. But I want to talk about this Basque model. In human experience, especially during traumatic experience, any component, any one of those four, can be disconnected from the other. And so, here's an example. Let's say that a woman, when she was a child, was abused in a room where there was a wood-burning stove. As an adult, she walks into a room where there's a wood-burning stove, or just the sense, the smell of wood burning. And all of a sudden, her heart rate increases. She's having a panic attack, and she cannot figure out why. I mean, that's a pleasant smell for most people. What's happening is she's getting the sensation, but the knowledge of that connection, the knowledge of what occurred during that wood burning when she was a child, isn't there at the forefront. There's a disconnect. So all of the effects come, but she can't connect. Why? I had a guy come and visit me from outside of our church. And he was really struggling with his wife's rage. And he described to me how even that morning he had a pair of trousers where the zipper needed to be fixed. And he asked if she would fix it. And she took those things, rolled them up in a ball, and heaved it right back in his face, shouted at him, and said, "No way am I doing that." And he's wondering, now it's easy for me standing on the outside to maybe surmise, and I was surmising, but I said to him, "Do you think there's any possibility that her perpetrator," she had been sexually abused as a child, he knew that. "Do you think there's any possibility that her perpetrator had her pull down the zipper of his pants and pull out his penis? Is there any chance that maybe that happened?" If you are a husband or wife and your mate was abused as a child, it's really one of the most healing things we can do as spouses is to be the best students of their lives and to know what those triggers are. In the men that I interviewed, the thing that was of highest difficulty for them was the social relationship with their wives. Yes, I mean, the sexuality issues were in there, but it was if they could just get along with their wives. You often hear the term in the literature, or read the term in the literature, walking on eggshells. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. Well, part of that can be eased if we understand the triggers that are going on. So, well, my goodness, there's a lot that I haven't covered, and I knew that would happen. But this is in your packets. And I would like you to also take more copies, if you would have use of more copies, to just have on hand to give to people you know. I lost count of the number of people as I was going through the research, the number of guys who said to me, "Man, I'm so glad you're doing this, because I have a friend whose wife was abused and they're divorced now." I mean, it's just it's not only in 4 marriages, but 1 in 4 women. So if you have a person to give this to, and be glad to come to any of your areas and speak more about it. closing words. Grooming and disclosure. Think about Bill Cosby. No one thought Bill Cosby, right? And it's just sad to have to realize that there could be some men in our congregations. Well, it could never be Mr. So-and-so. Well, Pamela did take the risk of sharing with her girlfriend's mom what was going on with her, and the girlfriend's mom responded, oh, it can never be Mr. So-and-so. Okay, so she was silenced for 22 years. We really need to be alert to the grooming, not only the grooming that the perpetrator does of the child, but the grooming that the perpetrator does of the community to make us think, oh, it can never be Mr. Now, that's not to say we're just going to suspect everybody. I mean, but we really need to pray for discernment. And then when disclosure is given, there are some really key things to take note of. If you go to the website, I've got some blogs on it, so not time to cover it today, but to equip yourselves, you'll find the blog on disclosure and just some things to avoid. We can't cause the healing, but we can sabotage the healing in how we respond to the disclosure. So, pardon me. I'm glad to pray. Just give me a minute to get my composure. Lord, I thank you that you are the healer. It's inevitable that there are some here in this room, and the pain is screaming out. I thank you, Lord, for the fact that your death and resurrection has not only covered our sin, but all of the effects of sin. And I pray that you would bring the right counsel along the pathway of those who desire help. I pray in this hour, Lord, that there would be a sense of hope. I thank you for what you've done for Pamela and me, and I pray that you would multiply it, because, Lord, you are the multiplier. Thank you for how you use the tragedies of life, and you reform everything, and you bring out redemptive purposes through it. Thank you. And I pray, Lord, that whatever situation we are in, that we would not interpret you through that situation, but that we would interpret our situation through the lens of who you really are. And I pray this in Jesus' name.